On July 1, 2025, it was announced that the South Korean government will send official delegates to observe Simon Ekpa's bail hearing in Finland on July 2, 2025, showing strong support for him and the Biafran movement he represents. Simon Ekpa and other leaders of the Biafran movement were invited to the September 2024 World Peace Summit in South Korea. Their attendance led to international recognition and the establishment of a Biafran liaison office in South Korea. Deputy Prime Minister of the United State of Biafra, Dr. Ngozi Orubueze, gave a powerful speech at the summit detailing the suffering of Biafrans in Nigeria. Her speech gained empathy and official backing from South Korean officials. South Korea and Finland maintain strong diplomatic and trade ties, including major military equipment deals. Observers believe Finland will act carefully in Simon Ekpa's trial to preserve this strategic relationship. Meanwhile, a Kenyan court declared Nnamdi Kanu's 2021 extradition from Kenya to Nigeria illegal and awarded him 10 million Kenyan shillings. Kenyan authorities have now sent formal memos to Nigerian courts reinforcing this ruling, possibly influencing Simon Ekpa's legal outcome by highlighting human rights violations. Simon Ekpa was arrested with 4 others in November 2024. While those individuals were quietly released, Simon Ekpa remains detained. The lack of transparency regarding the others' identities raises questions about selective justice. Nigeria's prosecution may argue that Simon Ekpa's influence, including past calls to boycott elections, could interfere with Nigeria's 2027 elections, particularly with Peter Obi declaring his intention to run, possibly fueling voter apathy in the southeast. Nigeria is lobbying Finland to deny Simon Ekpa bail, arguing his influence led to low voter turnout in the southeast during previous elections, especially in states that voted overwhelmingly against the ruling All Progressives Congress. Beyond the political trial, Simon Ekpa is entangled in a separate legal dispute with his ex-wife Marian Sakavava in Finland, who is seeking full custody of their children. This family issue further complicates his situation. On the first day of July in the year 2025, the news that spread across continents was both surprising and historic. From the heart of Seoul, the capital city of South Korea, came an unexpected diplomatic move that caught the attention of millions. The government of South Korea had officially announced that it would be sending a high-level delegation to the northern European country of Finland. The purpose of this diplomatic visit was neither business nor war, but rather a humanitarian and political stand. The South Korean delegates were traveling to Helsinki, the capital of Finland, to personally attend the court session where Simon Njoku Ekpa, a prominent Biafran activist and freedom campaigner, would be appearing to request bail after months in Finnish detention. Simon Njoku Ekpa, a legal resident of Finland and a dual citizen, had become one of the most controversial and visible voices of the Biafran liberation movement, following the arrest and continued detention of Matsi Nnamdi Kanu, the original leader of the indigenous people of Biafra. From his home in Lahti, Finland, Simon Njoku Ekpa coordinated media broadcasts, civil disobedience campaigns, and political agitation focused on liberating the southeastern region of Nigeria from what many supporters saw as systemic oppression, marginalization, and abuse by the central Nigerian government. Over time, his voice grew louder. His following multiplied across social media, and eventually, his voice crossed borders, touching lives in Europe, North America, and Asia. The moment South Korea declared its intention to send an official delegation to attend Simon Njoku Ekpa's court hearing, There was a ripple effect both in Finland and in Nigeria. This move was not an ordinary expression of concern from a foreign nation. It was a bold statement of international recognition. The government of South Korea had signaled that it was now paying attention not just to Simonyoku Ekpa as an individual, but to the entire Biafran struggle as a legitimate movement with roots in history, scars from suffering, and voices yearning to be heard. The seeds of this support had been planted nearly a year earlier. In September of 2024, a global event known as the World Peace Summit was hosted in South Korea, drawing together hundreds of political leaders, peace advocates, conflict negotiators, and grassroots organizers from around the world. Among the attendees were representatives of the Biafran movement. These included Simonyoku Ekpa himself, along with the Deputy Prime Minister of the self-proclaimed United States of Biafra, Dr. Ngozi Orubueze. Their presence at the summit was controversial to some and inspiring to others. But what truly turned heads was not just their attendance, it was their message. During that summit, Dr. Ngozi Orubueze stood before a global audience and delivered what many have described as one of the most powerful and emotional speeches in recent memory. In a calm but impassioned voice, she painted the daily reality of Biafrans living in southeastern Nigeria. She spoke of systemic killings. She highlighted military crackdowns. She drew attention to how children were being displaced, how families lived in fear, how elections were manipulated, and how the economy of the region was deliberately being sabotaged by policies of exclusion. The hall fell silent as Dr. Ngozi Orubueze explained how Biafran voices had been silenced for over 5 decades, ever since the end of the Nigerian Civil War in 1970. She described a people who had never fully recovered from genocide, from starvation, and from marginalization. Her words were not merely a plea for help, they were a demand for truth. And in that moment, South Korean officials began to pay attention. Following the summit, diplomatic conversations between Biafran representatives and the South Korean government intensified. The unexpected result of those discussions was the formal establishment of a Biafran liaison office in Seoul, a symbolic but significant gesture that showed South Korea was willing to offer some form of recognition to the Biafran cause. Though South Korea did not go as far as to recognize Biafra as a sovereign state, it took a step that few other countries had dared to take. It acknowledged the legitimacy of Biafran grievances, and it was willing to create a formal space for dialogue. This shift in South Korean policy raised questions in diplomatic circles around the world. What interest did South Korea have in an African secessionist movement? Was this a moral stance, or did it reflect a deeper strategic calculation? Some analysts pointed to the fact that South Korea and Finland have long maintained strong diplomatic and trade relationships. In particular, they have cooperated extensively in areas such as digital technology, renewable energy, education, and military equipment. Several major South Korean defense companies have signed contracts with Finnish partners, supplying them with advanced surveillance systems, cybersecurity tools, and other strategic technologies. This relationship, according to experts, may have prompted South Korea to get involved in a case where Finnish legal decisions could shape public perceptions of justice and human rights. On the other hand, it is also true that South Korea understands the legacy of colonialism and national division more intimately than most. The Korean peninsula itself remains divided between North and South, a painful reminder of foreign occupation and ideological conflict. Many South Korean citizens, especially younger generations, have grown increasingly empathetic to liberation struggles in other parts of the world. When they heard about Simon Njoku Ekpa and his advocacy for Biafra, they saw a reflection of their own national story. With that context, the July 2025 announcement by the South Korean government to send delegates to Finland was not only understandable, it was inevitable. By attending Simon Njoku Ekpa's bail hearing, South Korea was signaling to the world that this was not just a legal matter, but a humanitarian one. The hearing was scheduled to take place in a Helsinki courtroom on July 2, 2025. Simon Njoku Ekpa had been detained since November of the previous year, and the process surrounding his arrest had drawn criticism for its lack of transparency and consistency. According to available records, Simon Njoku Ekpa was arrested alongside 4 other individuals in a surprise operation by Finnish security agencies. While those other individuals were quietly released and allowed to return to their homes, Simon Njoku Ekpa remained in custody. No official explanation was given regarding the release of the others or the reason for Simon's prolonged detention. For many observers, this raised serious questions about selective justice and political motivation. Why was Simon Njoku Ekpa being singled out? Was there pressure from the Nigerian government behind his continued incarceration? Reports later revealed that the Nigerian authorities had indeed been lobbying their Finnish counterparts aggressively. According to sources close to the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, diplomats had been urging Finland to deny Simon Njoku Ekpa any chance of bail. Their argument was based on national security concerns. Specifically, Nigerian officials claimed that Simon's influence had significantly contributed to the low voter turnout in southeastern states during previous elections. They pointed to his repeated calls for boycotts, his online messages urging civil disobedience, and the atmosphere of fear that allegedly surrounded election days. This line of reasoning gained new traction in light of political developments back in Nigeria. Peter Gregory Obi, the former governor of Anambra State and a 2-time presidential contender, had recently announced that he would be running for the presidency again in the 2027 elections. His strongest base of support came from the southeastern region, Biafra land. But according to Nigerian officials, the persistent agitation for Biafran independence, fueled in large part by Simon Njoku Ekpa's activism, had made it increasingly difficult to mobilize voters in the region. They feared that his release could once again trigger calls for boycotts, thereby weakening the chances of opposition candidates and deepening the crisis of legitimacy in Nigeria's democracy. But this narrative was being challenged from multiple angles. On the same day that South Korea announced its support for Simon Njoku Ekpa, a court ruling from the East African country of Kenya sent shockwaves through the African legal community. A Kenyan high court declared that the 2021 abduction and extradition of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu from Nairobi to Abuja had been illegal. The court found that Kenyan and Nigerian security agencies had violated international laws governing extradition and personal liberties. As a result, the court awarded 10 million Kenyan shillings in damages to Mazi Nnamdi Kanu and formally instructed Kenyan authorities to send legal memos to Nigerian courts reinforcing this ruling. The significance of this development cannot be overstated. Simon Njoku Ekpa's legal defense team quickly seized on this decision, arguing that it highlighted a pattern of human rights violations targeting Biafran activists. If Nnamdi Kanu's abduction and detention had been ruled illegal, then the pressure placed on Simon Njoku Ekpa by Nigerian authorities must also be seen through a similar lens. The arrival of South Korean observers in Finland only strengthened this argument. giving Simon's legal team a rare opportunity to present his case not just before a Finnish judge, but before the court of global public opinion. Yet, Simon Joku Ekpa's troubles were not only political and legal, they were also personal. Complicating his situation even further was an ongoing family court dispute with his ex-wife, Marian Sakavav, who had filed for full custody of their children. This sensitive issue, playing out quietly in a separate courtroom, threatened to expose intimate details of his private life to the public. For Simon, this was an emotional battlefield he had hoped to avoid, but it now loomed over his bail hearing as a potential distraction. As the South Korean delegation landed at Helsinki-Vantaa Airport on the evening of July 1, 2025, they were greeted by members of the Biafran community in Finland, activists from human rights organizations, and a small group of Finnish journalists. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, questions flew through the air, but the South Korean officials remained composed. Their leader, a mid-level foreign affairs director named Hyun-Soo Kim, stated that their mission was clear: to observe, to support, and to ensure that justice was served without bias or external interference. The next day, when the court convened, the world watched. Inside the courtroom, Simon Joku Ekpa sat calmly, wearing a navy blue suit and a tie bearing the rising sun emblem of Biafra. His lawyers presented their arguments forcefully. They asked why Simon was still being held while others arrested alongside him had been released. They pointed to the Kenyan court ruling. They invoked Finland's proud tradition of neutrality and respect for international law. They reminded the court that freedom of speech was a cornerstone of Finnish democracy. And outside the courtroom, the South Korean delegation sat silently, watching every moment. Their presence alone had changed the atmosphere of the proceedings. For the first time in months, Simon Joku Ekpa did not feel completely alone. He now had an entire government observing his treatment, asking questions, and documenting every word. As the hearing continued into the evening, it became clear that this was more than a legal case. It was a turning point in the internationalization of the Biafran struggle. The involvement of South Korea had opened a door, and behind that door stood new possibilities, new alliances, new conversations, and new hope. And for millions of Biafrans across the world, especially those who had been following the story from towns and villages in southeastern Nigeria, it felt like a sign that their voices were finally being heard, that the world was beginning to understand their pain, and that maybe, just maybe, justice was no longer out of reach. The rest of the story was yet to unfold. But on July 1st, 2025, as South Korean delegates stepped onto Finnish soil, a new chapter began, one that may very well shape the future of Biafra and the legacy of Simon Joku Ekpa for generations to come. As the sun rose on the 2nd day of July in the year 2025, the city of Helsinki in Finland felt unusually charged. This wasn't the kind of tension that came from fear or violence. It was the quiet energy of something historic about to happen. The courthouse in central Helsinki was surrounded by peaceful demonstrators holding flags, placards and banners. Some were written in English, some in Finnish, and others in Igbo, the native language of most Biafrans. One banner stood out. It read, "Biafra is not terrorism. Justice for Simon Joku Ekpa." Another had an image of Masih Nnamdi Kanu beside Simon Joku Ekpa with the words, "Two voices, one struggle." Inside the courthouse, international media outlets were setting up their equipment. Cameras were mounted, reporters were rehearsing their lines. But what struck most people was the unusual presence of foreign government officials, most notably the South Korean delegation. They entered with a calm seriousness that made even Finnish court officers pause. These were not ordinary observers. They were sent by a sovereign Asian government that had deep respect for legal integrity and international peace. The fact that they were attending a bail hearing for a Nigerian-born political activist was not just newsworthy, it was diplomatic theatre. Simon Nyoku Ekpa, dressed modestly but with quiet dignity, walked into the courtroom surrounded by his legal team. His expression was calm. His hands were folded behind his back. He greeted the judge in Finnish. This was a man who had lived in Finland for years, raised a family there, paid taxes, and built a legal career. And yet now, he was sitting in a courtroom as a detained man, with accusations linking him to political unrest thousands of miles away in Nigeria. The hearing began with procedural remarks from the presiding judge, a senior Finnish jurist named Judge Olli Sarenmaa. The judge acknowledged the presence of the South Korean delegation, the representatives from the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the European human rights observers who had also arrived following growing media attention around the case. Judge Olli Sarenmaa made it clear that the hearing would be conducted according to Finnish law, guided by fairness, transparency, and respect for due process. Simon Nyoku Ekpa's legal counsel, led by a renowned Finnish human rights lawyer named Tuomas Lehtinen, began their defense with a powerful statement. He reminded the court that Simon Nyoku Ekpa had been in detention for over 7 months without a formal trial and with little explanation for the continued denial of bail. He stressed that the other 4 individuals arrested alongside Simon in November of 2024 had all been released without charges. None of them had faced prosecution. None of them had been publicly identified. Only Simon remained behind bars, he argued, because of his political influence and not because of any crime. Tuomas Lehtinen then turned to the Kenyan court ruling from a few days earlier. He presented official court documents from Nairobi showing that Mazi Nnamdi Kanu's arrest in 2021 had been deemed illegal by the Kenyan judiciary. The ruling had awarded Mazi Nnamdi Kanu 10 million Kenyan shillings in compensation and called his extradition to Nigeria a gross violation of international law. This, the lawyer argued, proved a pattern of unlawful targeting of Biafran leaders. He questioned whether Finland was now falling into the same pattern by holding Simon Nyoku Ekpa without charge. The prosecution team, representing Finnish legal authorities but working in cooperation with Nigerian government liaisons, countered the defense. They insisted that Simon Nyoku Ekpa's influence had real-world consequences. They played video clips of Simon's past broadcasts where he called for sit-at-home protests in southeastern Nigeria. They showed media footage of disrupted elections in 2023 and 2024. They alleged that Simon Ekpa's voice had created fear, confusion, and instability in Nigerian communities, particularly in states like Anambra, Abia, Enugu, Ebonyi, and Imo. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.